In this nugget, we're going to take a look at the specific steps that you and I can use to build our own lab environments to get the hands-on practice with vSphere. Let's begin. An absolutely huge part of this course, as you and I go through it together, is for you to do hands-on practice, which involves you building your own lab. So what I wanted to do is take a moment and chat with you about the basic design and the concept for building a lab so that you can set it up on your own and then follow along with me as we go through these nuggets together. Now, one of the thoughts I had was we could use physical equipment for a lot of our devices. For example, we could get a physical computer for our ESXi1 device. We could get another physical computer for the host ESXi2. We could get another physical device for our Active Directory Windows server. We could get another physical device to be the home for our vCenter server. And if we want to set up some storage, we could have a separate, another physical device to provide network-based storage with iSCSI or NFS. Now, the trick with that, if we did all of that on separate physical gear, I see 5 different physical computers that we would need. Now, I, I don't know about you, but I don't have 5 separate, ready to go physical servers that I could just boot up and set up as part of a lab environment here in my home office. And secondly, even if I did, it's going to take a lot of power and it's going to generate a lot of heat as well. Especially here in Vegas. Last week it was 113 degrees here where I live. I don't I don't need any additional help in getting it warmer inside the house. So that's our challenge. How do we get this lab environment up and running and working without having to have all of the physical gear in place? One solution, which is what I'm encouraging you to do along with me, is to set up a virtualized environment for our lab. And to do that, we are going to use a VMware Workstation as our Type 2 hypervisor and build our entire virtualized lab environment in VMware Workstation. So for example, here's our PC that we're currently going to be using. And that PC is running an application called VMware Workstation. And here's the details, just so you know what they are for this PC. It has an i7 Intel processor. It's got the virtualization technology from Intel enabled in the BIOS. That's important for this nested virtualization, which we're going to do to build our lab. If you have an AMD processor, they have a thing called AMD virtualization. Either way, you'd want to make sure that your computer supports the virtualization and that it's enabled in the BIOS. And I checked a few minutes ago and I did a Google search regarding virtualization technology, and there's just a boatload of documents and videos on YouTube that will walk you through enabling virtualization technology in the BIOS of your computer that supports it. In addition, this PC that we're going to be running VMware Workstation on has 32 gigabytes of memory. Now you could probably get away with less than that for the demonstrations that I want to do and to go through it smoothly and not have a lot of delays. Having that amount of RAM in this host computer, this PC, is just going to enable me to do things a little bit faster than if I had, for example, just 16. So if you're looking at minimums, I would say you should have a minimum of at least 16 gigabytes of RAM, and the more the better. The operating system running on this PC that's going to be running the VMware Workstation, I've currently got Windows 8.1 Professional. And if you're running Windows 7 or Windows 10 or some other flavor of Windows, as long as it's a 64-bit version of the operating system, you should be fine. And for the VMware Workstation product, I am running version 11. So I wanted to share all of that information with you up front so you can know exactly what we're working with in these nuggets. And that way, as you create your own lab, the closer you can get to these ingredients that I have on this PC, the more likely it is that your lab environment will be virtually identical to the one that we are going to create together as we go through these nuggets together. And then in VMware Workstation, we can go ahead and create a virtual machine as an Active Directory domain controller. And we can create a virtual machine for our vCenter server. And we have some choices when it comes to that. For this vCenter server, we could go ahead and deploy it as its own virtual machine inside of VMware Workstation. We also have the option to go ahead and run it as a VM that's running as one of the VMs on one of our ESXi hosts. So we'll discuss those options further when we cover the nugget on vCenter server as a separate nugget. But as a bare minimum, we're going to be creating ESXi1 as a virtual machine inside of VMware Workstation, along with ESXi2 also as a virtual machine. Now, here is the big secret. None of these devices, the ESXi host, which are both going to be running as VMs inside of VMware Workstation, they are not going to know that they are not running on real hardware. So it's a little lying game that we're doing, and the whole purpose of doing this nested virtualization is that you and I, my friend, can build this entire lab on one physical computer using a Type 2 hypervisor, specifically VMware Workstation, instead of needing to have multiple physical machines to build our lab. The other thing I'd like you to be aware of right now is how I have my VMware Workstation networking configured. So on this PC, it has a network adapter, a NIC, a network interface card, and it is physically connected to the 192.168.1 network here in my home office. So in our network, that 192.168.1 network is going to be our management network that we're going to use to communicate between Active Directory, the vCenter server appliance once we get that set up, as well as ESXi1 and ESXi2. They will all be connected to this management network, which is 192.168.1.0. The virtual network editor, which I'll show you here in just a moment, which is part of VMware Workstation, I've currently got it set up so that the logical network interface of VMnet 0 inside of VMware Workstation is bridged to that 192.168.1 network. So effectively, my physical network interface card on this PC running VMware Workstation is going to be in the same VLAN, the same IP subnet of 192.168.1.0 as the Active Directory server, the vCenter server appliance, and ESXi1 and ESXi2 as soon as those devices are configured inside of VMware Workstation. I've also got inside of VMware Workstation 4 additional networks. These are logical networks. Think of them like VLANs that are set up inside of VMware Workstation. Think of them as individual VLANs, individual subnets. And they are VMnet 1, 2, 3, and 4. And each one of those are host only. So that means they don't really connect to the outside world. They're just logical networks that are created, made up, if you will, in the mind of the VMware Workstation application that is running on this PC. And here's how we're going to use these logical networks. VMnet 1 is going to be used for storage. So I'll put a 1 right here next to storage. VMnet 2 is going to be used for a feature called vMotion, which is a really sweet feature that allows us to, on the fly, move a virtual machine from one host, for example ESXi1, over to a second host, for example ESXi2. And the vMotion network is a dedicated network that we're going to use for the transfer of that information between ESXi hosts. VMnet 3 is going to be used for one of our virtual machine networks, and VMnet 4 is going to be used for a second virtual machine network. So for example, if this virtual machine right here, let's say that's VM number 1, if we want to logically connect that to the VM network of 10.3.3.0, we can do that. We can do it in software. Or if we want to connect VM number 1 to the 10.4.4 network, once again, we can do that in software. So to help simplify that as well as far as the numbering goes, VMnet 1 is going to support the 10.1.1 subnet. VMnet 2 is going to support the 10.2.2 subnet. VMnet 3 is going to support the 10.3.3 subnet. And VMnet 4 is going to support the 10.4.4 subnet. And one of the challenges is, by default, your VMware workstation, once you have that installed on this computer, where we're going to build this entire virtualized lab environment, it's not going to have all of these VMnets set up by default. We're going to need to go in to the virtual network editor as part of VMware Workstation and create any VMnets that don't exist by default that we want to use. So what I'd love to do right now is walk you through how to use the virtual network editor as part of VMware Workstation to modify and create the VMnets as we need them for the lab. So here is VMware Workstation 11. Now, if you don't have a copy or a license for a VMware Workstation, you can sign up for a free 30-day eval directly from VMware. If we go up to Edit, and from the drop-down, if we select the Virtual Network Editor, this is where we configure the networking portion inside of VMware Workstation. Now, initially, when the Virtual Network Editor comes up, we don't have the ability to change any settings. If we want the ability to change settings, we're going to click on this button down here that says Change Settings. The User Account Control feature, which I have enabled on this Windows 8.1 host, is asking me to confirm if I want to allow the Virtual Network Editor application, which is part of VMware Workstation, to be able to make changes to this computer, and I'm going to click on Yes. And here it's showing me all of the VMnets that I have. So currently I've got VMnet 0, which is bridged to my outside 192.168.1 network. That's a physical network associated with that VLAN. And then I have 4 additional networks, VMnet 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're all configured as host only, meaning they only logically exist in the mind of VMware Workstation on this host computer. Then I've also associated the 4 subnets that we're going to be using in conjunction with those VLANs. So in your configuration, if you're looking at this and saying, wow, gosh, I don't have a VMnet 1 or a VMnet 2 or a VMnet 3 or a VMnet 4, how do I create them? The answer is simple. To create an additional network, we simply click on Add Network. Because I currently have VMnets 0 through 4, it's saying that VMnet 5 would be the next logical one. So I'll go ahead and click on OK to accept that. And by default, it shows this address of 192.168.230. Now, that's not the address that we want to use. So we can go down here to subnet IP and simply change it. So I'm going to put this as 10.5.5.0 with a 24-bit mask. I'm also going to say I do not want to use a local DHCP service to hand out IP addresses. I'm going to be using a Windows server that's also on the respective subnets to hand out IP addresses. Also, if you didn't want the host computer to have a logical interface on this new subnet, you can simply deselect the checkbox that says connect a host virtual adapter to this network. In my configuration, what I chose to do is I chose to allow it to have an interface on each of these additional networks. And so I did that for VMnet 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I just created 5 as a demonstration. We don't really need VMnet 5, so I'm going to select it and click on Remove Network. And what I'd love for you to do is to go ahead and configure VMware Workstation so that you also have VMnet 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 all set up and ready to go. And on my bridged network, so VMnet 0 is bridged to my Ethernet network card on the VMware Workstation host, and that goes out to the 192.168.1.0 network. And that also has a 24-bit mask. And in my topology, because my home office network has that 192.168.1 network, I also have a default gateway at 192.168.1.1 that I can use on that network as a default gateway that also does network address translation and has reachability out to the public internet. So once we've made those changes, we can go ahead and click on OK. And now my VMware workstation has 5 VMnets, 0 through 4, with the first one being bridged and the remaining 4 VMnets are all representing 4 different separate VLANs and their associated IP subnets that are all in the mind, if you will, of this VMware workstation host that we're going to be building this environment in. In this nugget, we've identified some design goals that we can use to create an entire lab environment inside of VMware Workstation running on a single host. And as part of the VMware Workstation configuration, I am asking you to configure your VM networks inside of VMware Workstation so that you also have these 5 networks. If it's possible for you to bridge to a physical network that is 192.168.1, that will be a lot easier for you because you won't have to make changes in your mind every time we talk about the 192.168.1 management network. If that's the same IP address space that you are using also in your lab environment for the management network, it'll be easier to follow along. In the event that you do need to use a different network for the physical network, for the management network, you could do that as well, but just make a big note, put it on a post-it note somewhere that every time in the labs, as we talk about the 192.168.1 subnet, that in your lab, it's really the 10.x network or whatever it is you're using for that substitution. Again, when possible, I would encourage you to use the same exact networks that I'm using in the nuggets. So here are the action items, my friend. Number 1, identify a computer that you're going to use to run VMware Workstation. Make sure it has at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. If you can get up to 32, that's even better. Make sure that virtualization technology or the equivalent on the AMD side is enabled in the BIOS. You'd want to make sure that your operating system, for example, I'm running Windows 8.1, make sure your operating system is a 64-bit operating system. And have VMware Workstation installed. And if possible, I'd recommend you use VMware Workstation version 11, which is what we're going to be using together as we go through these nuggets. And then inside of VMware Workstation, use the virtual network editor to go ahead and set up these additional VMnets in preparation for deploying our lab inside of VMware Workstation. It's quiz time! Quiz time! Question number 1. Which version of VMware Workstation is desirable for the purposes of creating our lab environment? And the key word there is desirable. Not possible, but desirable. And optimally, you'll have VMware Workstation 11. Everything that you and I can do to simulate and replicate each other's environment, the better success you're going to have as you build your own lab. Next question, how much RAM should the Windows host have? And ideally, we'd have 32 gigs. On our Windows host running VMware Workstation, if you only have 16 gigs, it is possible to pull it off with that as well, but the more RAM, the better. Question number 3, should you enable the virtualization technology on the Intel platform or the virtualization technology on the AMD platform in BIOS on the computer that's running VMware Workstation? And the answer is absolutely yes. You need to enable that, and that also implies that you need to have a computer that supports that. And last but not least, how many host-only VMnets will we be using in VMware Workstation? Now, as I recall, we had VMnet 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that looks like 5, but the trick here is how many host-only VMnets are we going to be using? VMnet 0 was bridged to my outside network, which is the 192.168.1 network, which we're going to be using for management purposes in our lab environment. And VMnets 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is a total of 4 more, are host-only VMnets that we're going to be using for features such as storage, vMotion, and a couple of networks that we're going to use for our virtual machines once we have them deployed on the ESXi hosts. I am glad that you joined me for this nugget. Please remember to get VMware Workstation up and ready, because in our next nugget, we're going to take a look at deploying some virtual machines inside of VMware Workstation as we start to actually build the lab environment. Again, thanks for joining me. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.